All right, everyone, there's a sea change currently happening in the world diplomatic and economic situation. I don't think that it upends the Western liberal world order or destroys the United States and it goes Byzantium. Those particular pessimistic takes, or optimistic if you don't like the Western Bloc, and certainly some of the actions of NATO lately have been a little bit subpar, let's point that out, admittedly. Be a fan of your country, but patriotism doesn't mean blindly questioning everything that its government does. Unfortunately, what's happening right now, due to a combination of factors, is the Eastbloc is sort of reconsolidating. Used to be more of a thing back in the day, although I will point out through the Cold War, there were actually two East Blocs. Well, technically three, but the two main ones actually fought one another in the proxy war sense repeatedly, especially in the 70s. And those were the Soviet Union and China. The two countries effectively split apart on various parts of communist doctrine, on their geostrategic aims, their economic systems actually too, by the way, whether it was Maoism or Stalinism that was better. And then they fought one another repeatedly through third-party states. Just look at Cambodia or the repeated invasions of Vietnam by China, for an example. Of course, the Chinese, once they were given atomic technology by the Russians, very quickly and expediently expanded that program so they could gain their independence from their former Soviet friends. After that, they got along a little bit less. China stayed hardline up until the 1980s. Russia had been slowly moving in the direction of some sort of facade laissez-faire in order to stabilize its economy, which China more successfully did. The Soviets effectively knocked themselves on their ass. China actually managed to do it. I guess in the end, their particular communist doctrine was more stable. There are cultural reasons for this. Now the two are drawing closer together, so the old sort of bickering is partially gone. There is one big problem for the East Bloc in full admission. China has become egotistical because of its vast success economically. Its success the same way that the Soviets had military successes in World War II with the Lend-Lease, which is that the U.S. has been pumping China full of Coca-Cola, and because of that, their economic model has become, at least outwardly, more liberalized. Morally, they're still just as authoritarian as if they were under Maoism, effectively. China now sees Russia, I think, as a junior partner. I think that China realizes that it has all of the cards other than the massive nuke stockpile. They're going to wait until the Russian economy fails to pace the Chinese economy and eventually has to downsize its military capabilities, and then China's expecting to effectively rule over the eastern sphere. Russia has different plans in mind. So does India. India is the most interesting wild card here because under Trump, Modi leaned west. Quite clearly, he got along famously with Trump. They saw eye to eye on many issues. While he tolerates Joe Biden, I think he sees him as weak. And so India has moved further to the left, where for some years it had been moving more towards the Western Bloc. The same is true of Egypt. Egypt is prepared to potentially join BRICS in the future. Several other countries are as well. Meanwhile, India could end up leaving them. Of course, if India becomes a bigger economy and military player than China, and there are foreshock rumblings that it is, maybe they end up taking over the bloc or making their own. Greater India is definitely part of their goal. They do want to invade and take over Pakistan and Bangladesh. Whether that ends up happening, we shall wait and see. It's more likely to have a political than a military trigger. If India really succeeds, all the people in perpetually impoverished Bangladesh will be like, well, their model does seem to work better, and we could definitely more easily get a shit ton of investment once the money is able to flow internally. Yeah, maybe we'll vote for annexation. I wouldn't put it past Bangladesh to actually join up in solidarity with their Indian cousins unilaterally. Pakistan, that would be definitely more of a hard sell. And the reason why the rise of the East is occurring right now, and Turkey's another big wild card. They're in NATO, but there's some fence straddling by Erdogan. If they had gone far left in their election, they would definitely be sucking off Putin right now. Despite the feigned greater liberality than Erdogan's people, I see through the socialistic ploy. It would have only been a matter of time. Probably would have left NATO, actually. The reason why this is happening centrally is the incompetence of the current administration. and the effect of lockdowns and worldwide panic. So it's reshuffled the deck effectively. I do not expect this new Eastbloc to destroy the United States as the world power, the world's dominant power. I don't expect it to erode NATO as the world's dominant military alliance, and I don't expect it to be the death of the dollar. BRICS' new gold-backed currency is going to destroy everything. Well, having a currency pegged to gold has some minor issues with it, mainly that gold is publicly traded and rises and falls in price, thus affecting your currency in a manner that is out of your own hands. That would be a problem, and you can't necessarily fix the price of gold in a globalized world market, so the East could cordon itself off. They could internalize and say, okay, we rule Asia, basically, and then Asia has become its own pole. That won't work long term because of the allocation of resources in various areas, and of course nations that are in Asia that are extremely west-leaning, like South Korea, Japan, to an extent now the Philippines, I suppose. It's funny, the Philippines gets along with Biden better than India does. It's very, very strange. Under Duterte, it's definitely Trump time. This is because of Biden's illegitimacy and incompetence, though, centrally. The central diplomatic power of the entire Western world is an aging vegetable, incapable of delivering a short speech without making major verbal gaffes. He's not interested in diplomacy with some parts of the Eastern Bloc. He refuses to even talk to the Russians. The United States under Biden has effectively shut down any attempt at negotiations there, and for all of the Western bravado about, well, Ukraine's doing fine, Putin expected to win in 3 days, and he's having some real big problems. Russia has enough manpower and time on its hands to just grind Ukraine down and eventually force a perpetual stalemate. And that's probably what Putin at this point is aiming for anyway. The Russians will establish de facto control over parts of Ukraine. Ukraine will never formally recognize it as annexed territory, but for all intents and purposes it will be. And Russia can wait, because there's no chance of them being reinvaded once they've established that de facto control. The Ukrainians have largely left Crimea alone for a reason. Supposedly it's still theirs, but they sure don't appear to be acting as though it is. Why? Because it's probably not a great idea to invade a country with thousands of nuclear weapons. Probably suicidal, because you don't have any nuclear weapons. I wouldn't put it past Ukraine to want to develop them, although it require them becoming effectively a pariah state. I suppose the West might make an exception for them, or Taiwan, or South Korea. They've all been clamoring to varying degrees. Japan, although I don't think anyone worries whether Japan has nukes. I think they can be trusted with nuclear weapons. Maybe a little bit less so Ukraine at this point. Zelensky's still a tin horn. The people there are suffering, and I sympathize with them, but your leadership sucks. There's a reason he's such good friends with Vegetable Joe. Anyway, the Eastern Bloc is rising. Don't expect it to supplant the West. No, that's not what I'm predicting. I'm simply saying that the world diplomatic situation will become much more dicey, and all of this was completely avoidable. All we had to do was go down further the route of populism, and there never would have been a trigger for the war in Ukraine. We would have had, under Trump, we would have had a leader that was actually respected by countries that would potentially invade their neighbors. Or if not respected, at least feared enough for being a madman that they wouldn't dare to do so. Right now, Ukraine would not be half occupied by Russians if Trump were in office. That is a guarantee. And it ain't because he's a Russian pawn. No. It's because the Russians were afraid of him, and rightfully so. He was effectively speak softly and carry a big stick. Progressives should love the dude. He sounds like fucking Teddy Roosevelt. That's about all. Peace out.